How's it going, guys? So generally it is a rule of thumb to never let your frame rate dip below 30 FPS when you're playing a video game. However, just because you might be achieving an average FPS of 30 or above doesn't necessarily mean that your frame rate never dips below 30, because there are certain graphically intensive moments in your game that might cause it to drop down just like that. So with that said, I'm going to be benchmarking 3 different cards today and seeing what the highest optimal settings each of them can operate at in Crysis 3 before the frame rate ever dips below 30. So I know this is kind of a experimental benchmarking video that I'm doing here, but hopefully by the end of it you will have a better idea of which settings you should be operating at to play Crysis 3 smoothly and consistently. And this is especially going to be relevant to those of you who actually own one of the cards that I'm testing today. So with that said, why don't we take a look at the benchmark loop that I ran for all of these tests. Okay, so this is literally the first mission of the campaign, but it has a ton of shadows and several explosive barrels that actually produce quite a bit of smoke and particle effects. I'm also happy to announce that I did run this test at both 1920 by 1080 and 2560 by 1600 resolutions. Unfortunately, I didn't buy a high-res panel or anything like that, guys. I'm just borrowing it from a friend. Or so he thinks. For my testing procedure, I initially ran each of the cards at max settings and gradually scaled them back until the minimum frame rate was just above 30 FPS. At that point, I left the settings alone and proceeded to run this loop 5 times for each card at both resolutions. After benchmarking all the runs with fraps, I simply took the average min, max, and average frame rates and packaged them all nicely into a pretty chart, which I'm going to show you in a second. So we'll let the rest of this loop finish out, and then we'll go over the hardware I used.
I'll just kill him. Okay, let's move.
So if you guys have been keeping up with my recent videos, you'll notice that this slide looks quite a bit different than what it usually does. And that's simply because I got a hold of some pretty awesome high-end hardware that I'm really just borrowing, like the high-res panel that I mentioned earlier. So you can see here I've temporarily upgraded to a 3960X, as well as an Asus Rampage 4 formula and 16 gigs of awesome G-Skill Trident X, clocked at 1600 MHz. And the cards that I used for this test were the GeForce GTX Titan, the reference GTX 680, as well as the reference Radeon HD 7970. And you can see I've updated to the latest drivers and all that jazz. But moving on to our first test at 1920 by 1080, you can see here that the Titan, even when overclocked, was just barely, super close to achieving full max settings, but I did have to bump down the anisotropic filtering to 8x when Crysis 3 gives you the option to go all the way up to 16x. But you can see there I still got 53.8 frames per second on average, and the card does come with its temp target already set at 80 degrees, so you can see that there in red. All the max temps, by the way, are there listed in red next to their respective cards. But moving on to the reference GTX 680, actually why don't we just talk about that and the 7970 together, because they kind of go hand in hand on this slide. You can see there all the settings for both cards are exactly the same, but if you look to the chart to the right, you can see that the 680 clearly did better as far as frames per second go. So it got 66.1 on average, whereas the 7970 was only able to achieve 60.1 frames per second with the same settings. Now at 2560 by 1600 resolution, this is where I really started to have to make some sacrifices with the Titan. Even overclocked, I had to bump down all the system specs to high, as well as the texture resolution. And you can see there SMAA and anisotropic filtering both took a hit, had to reduce both of those to 2x. If you take a look at the average frames per second there on the right, you can see that with the 680 and the 7970, they both got the exact same score at 55.4 FPS. But just like the last slide, this isn't a tie, because if you look at the settings for the 7970, I was able to achieve that score at 4x anisotropic filtering, whereas the 680 had to be bumped down to 1x just to keep up. But unfortunately for both cards, I had to completely disable anti-aliasing, and all the system specs had to be bumped down to medium. Alright guys, and there you have it. And really quickly I did want to point out that you don't have to necessarily use the same settings that I did in order to achieve those same frame rates. You could have bumped down your anisotropic filtering to 4x and essentially doubled your SMAA. As long as it balances out, you're going to get similar results as I did. Relatively speaking. But it all really comes down to what you prioritize in your gameplay experience. Aside from that, what do you guys think of this kind of testing? Do you find this kind of information useful or beneficial to you, or should I stop doing it and carry on with something else? I'm really curious to know, so leave your thoughts in the section below. And that's going to do it for this video. Thank you all for watching. Be sure to thumbs up this video if you found it informative. And yeah, subscribe to Awesome Sauce News if you haven't already. And I will see you guys in the next video.